September 29, 1982. In homes across America, parents reached into medicine cabinets for the same trusted remedy they'd used countless times before. Extra-strength Tylenol. The household name that promised relief from pain, fever, the ordinary suffering of daily life. But in Chicago, someone had turned that trust into a weapon. Someone had transformed America's most popular painkiller into an instrument of random, senseless murder. 7 innocent people would die in just 3 days. An entire nation would be paralyzed by fear. And the person responsible would vanish into the shadows, leaving behind a mystery that remains unsolved to this very day. The morning of September 28, 1982, began like any other in the suburban home of the Kellerman family in Elk Grove Village. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up complaining of a sore throat, the kind of minor ailment that every parent knows how to handle. Her parents, Dennis and Gina Kellerman, did what millions of American families did every day. They reached for the medicine cabinet, pulled out a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and gave their daughter a single capsule to ease her discomfort. Within hours, Mary Kellerman would be dead. Not from the flu, not from some rare childhood disease, but from potassium cyanide that someone had deliberately packed into what should have been a healing medication. The 12-year-old girl had unknowingly become the first victim of what would become one of America's most terrifying unsolved crimes. Her parents, thinking they were providing comfort to their sick child, had instead given her a dose of poison so lethal that death came swiftly and without warning. But Mary Kellerman wasn't the only victim that day. Across Chicago's suburbs, other families were reaching for the same trusted brand, the same familiar red and white capsules. And with each bottle opened, each pill swallowed, a killer's plan was unfolding with deadly precision. Later that same day, September 29th, Adam Janis, a 27-year-old postal worker in Arlington Heights, was feeling the aches and pains of what seemed like a minor illness. Like Mary Kellerman's parents hours earlier, he reached for relief in a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Like Mary, he would be dead within hours. But the horror was just beginning for the Janis family. When Adam collapsed and died suddenly in his home, his family rushed to be by his side in their darkest hour. His brother Stanley, 25, and sister-in-law Terry, just 19 years old, came to support each other through their grief and confusion. In a twist of fate so cruel it seems impossible to believe, Stanley and Terry found the same bottle of Tylenol that had killed Adam. Still reeling from shock, still struggling to understand what had happened, they took the medication for their own headaches brought on by stress and grief. Within hours, 3 members of the same family were dead. Not from a genetic disease, not from a car accident, but from a bottle of over-the-counter medication that sat in millions of American homes. 3 funerals where there should have been none. A family shattered by something so random, so senseless, that investigators couldn't initially comprehend what they were dealing with. The Janis family had become victims of the first act of what experts would later call product tampering terrorism. By October 1, 1982, the pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear to investigators and medical examiners across Chicago. Over the next few days, 3 more strange deaths occurred. 35-year-old Mary McFarland of Elmhurst, Illinois, 35-year-old Paula Prince of Chicago, and 27-year-old Mary Weiner of Winfield, Illinois. All of them, it turned out, took Tylenol shortly before they died. 7 people. 7 families. 7 lives cut short by an invisible killer who had weaponized the most mundane act imaginable, taking a pain reliever. The victims were Mary Kellerman, Mary McFarland, Mary Lynn Reiner, Paula Prince, and Stanley, Adam, and Terry Janis. Their only connection was geography and circumstance. They didn't know each other, hadn't crossed paths, shared no enemies. Their only shared experience was reaching for the same trusted brand of medication in their moment of need. The killer had chosen the perfect weapon. Tylenol was everywhere, in medicine cabinets, purses, office desk drawers, kitchen counters. The red and white capsules were as common and trusted as aspirin, used by millions of Americans who never questioned their safety. The poisonings led to the adoption of tamper-proof packaging for over-the-counter medications. But that protection came too late for the 7 innocent people who had paid the ultimate price for society's trust in pharmaceutical safety. The deaths triggered a nationwide recall of the product, as authorities realized that contaminated bottles could be anywhere in the supply chain. Suddenly, every medicine cabinet in America had become a potential crime scene. Every headache, every fever, every minor ache took on terrifying implications. Parents threw away bottles of children's Tylenol. Hospitals emptied their supplies. Pharmacies pulled products from shelves as quickly as they could manage. The economic impact was staggering, but the psychological impact was even greater. The Tylenol incident raised renewed fears during Halloween, with some communities discouraging trick-or-treating. If someone could poison medicine bottles, what else might they contaminate? Halloween candy? Food products? The randomness of the attacks meant that anyone, anywhere, could be next. The killer had achieved something no terrorist had managed before: complete disruption of daily American life through the corruption of something as basic as medical care. They had turned healing into murder, safety into terror, trust into paranoia. And throughout it all, the person responsible remained a ghost. No demands, no manifesto, no clear motive. Just death, delivered through the most innocent means imaginable. The FBI, Chicago police, and multiple suburban departments launched one of the most intensive investigations in American history. They faced a unique challenge: a killer who had never directly contacted their victims, who had used no traceable weapon, who could strike anywhere and disappear without a trace. The investigation revealed how the attacks may have been carried out by buying Tylenol, adding cyanide to the bottles, and returning them to the store shelves. It was a method so simple, so low-tech, that it was almost impossible to prevent or trace. Detectives visited every pharmacy, grocery store, and drugstore in the affected areas. They analyzed purchase records, interviewed employees, studied security footage. They were looking for someone who had bought Tylenol and returned to the same stores, someone who might have appeared nervous or suspicious. But the killer had been careful, methodical, almost invisible. They had chosen their locations strategically, spreading the contaminated bottles across different stores in different suburbs. The randomness that made their crimes so terrifying also made them nearly impossible to solve. Hundreds of investigators worked around the clock. Thousands of tips poured in from a terrified public. Every suspicious purchase, every strange behavior, every theory was investigated with desperate thoroughness. And then, just when it seemed the killer might never be identified, a letter arrived that would change everything about the investigation. James W. Lewis, who did accounting work, became the leading suspect in the Tylenol murders because he sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million or else more people would be killed. The letter, postmarked from New York, claimed responsibility for the Chicago deaths and promised more killings unless the ransom was paid. For investigators who had been working without a single solid lead, the extortion letter was both a breakthrough and a new source of frustration. Lewis had made himself a suspect, but was he the killer or just an opportunistic criminal trying to profit from someone else's crimes? Upon his arrest, Lewis told authorities how the person behind the attacks may have carried out the killings by buying Tylenol, adding cyanide to the bottles, and returning them to the store shelves. Lewis was also found to have previously possessed a poisoning book, and his knowledge of the methodology seemed suspiciously detailed. But knowledge isn't proof. Lewis could have learned the same information from news reports, from his own research, or from simple deduction about how such crimes might be committed. His letter to Johnson & Johnson made him guilty of extortion, but it didn't make him guilty of murder. The investigation into James Lewis would consume years, involve multiple agencies, and generate thousands of pages of evidence. But it would never produce the one thing that families of the victims desperately needed: definitive answers about who had killed their loved ones and why. For decades, investigators pursued every possible angle in the Lewis case. They analyzed his movements, his finances, his background. They searched for connections between Lewis and Chicago, between Lewis and the victims, between Lewis and anyone who might have helped him carry out the attacks. As recently as 2022, Lewis was interviewed for hours outside of his Boston home, as investigators continued their relentless pursuit of the truth. Even after 40 years, the case remained active, the questions unanswered, the families still waiting for justice. Lewis consistently denied involvement in the murders while serving prison time for the extortion charges. He admitted to writing the letter demanding money from Johnson & Johnson, but claimed he had no involvement in the actual poisonings. He painted himself as an opportunist who had tried to profit from someone else's crimes, not as a killer. But investigators found troubling patterns in Lewis's background. He had a history of suspicious behavior, previous run-ins with law enforcement, and what seemed like detailed knowledge of how the crimes had been committed. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, but it wasn't enough for a murder conviction. The prime suspect, James Lewis, died Sunday at age 76 in July 2023, taking with him any secrets he might have held about the most infamous unsolved murders in Chicago history. His death marked the end of one chapter in the investigation, but not the end of the search for truth. The questions that had haunted investigators for 4 decades remained as pressing as ever. The Tylenol murders changed America in ways that are still felt today. The poisonings led to the adoption of tamper-proof packaging for over-the-counter medications, transforming how pharmaceutical products are manufactured, distributed, and sold. Every time you struggle to open a bottle of aspirin, every time you have to pierce through multiple layers of safety seals, every time you see tamper-evident packaging, you're experiencing the legacy of 7 people who died in Chicago in 1982. But the changes went beyond packaging. The murders fundamentally altered the relationship between consumers and products, introducing a level of suspicion and caution that hadn't existed before. They proved that in an open society, anyone with criminal intent could weaponize the most basic aspects of daily life. Investigators are still searching for the person responsible for killing 7 people by poisoning bottles of Tylenol with cyanide 41 years ago. The case remains open, the evidence is still being analyzed, and the hope for justice never truly dies. The families of the victims have waited more than 4 decades for answers. Mary Kellerman's parents, the surviving members of the Janus family, the loved ones of Mary McFarland, Mary Reiner, and Paula Prince, they have lived with the knowledge that someone got away with murder, that justice was denied, that questions may never be answered. Today, the Tylenol murders stand as one of America's most significant unsolved crimes. Despite decades of investigation, despite thousands of hours of police work, despite advances in forensic science that couldn't have been imagined in 1982, the person responsible has never been definitively identified. The case represents both the best and the limitations of American law enforcement. The investigation was thorough, professional, and unrelenting. But it also demonstrated how a carefully planned crime, executed with patience and precision, can defeat even the most sophisticated investigative techniques. James Lewis took many secrets to his grave in 2023, but whether those secrets included the truth about the Tylenol murders remains unknown. He was the prime suspect for 40 years, but he was never charged with the actual killings. He may have been a killer who successfully evaded justice, or he may have been a criminal opportunist who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The real killer, whether Lewis or someone else entirely, achieved something remarkable in the worst possible way. They committed 7 murders and were never caught. They terrorized an entire nation and disappeared without consequence. They changed American society forever and left no trace of their identity. But perhaps most remarkably, they stopped. After 7 deaths and nationwide panic, the poison Tylenol bottles stopped appearing. The killer simply vanished, leaving behind only victims, grieving families, and questions that may never be answered. In the end, the Tylenol murders aren't really about the investigation, the suspect, or even the mystery itself. They're about 7 innocent people whose lives were stolen by someone who saw human beings as acceptable casualties in whatever twisted game they were playing. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. She should have grown up, gone to high school, maybe college. She should have had first dates, graduation parties, perhaps children of her own. Instead, her life ended with a sore throat and a trusted medication that had been turned into poison. Adam Janus was a postal worker, a brother, a son. Stanley Janus was just 25, his wife Terry only 19. They died trying to cope with Adam's sudden death, victims of the same poison that had killed the person they were mourning. Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Lynn Reiner were women in their 20s and 30s with jobs, families, futures that were cut short by random, senseless violence. These 7 people shared nothing except geography and misfortune. They didn't know each other, had never met, had no idea their names would be forever linked by tragedy. Their only connection was that they all reached for the same medication on the same few days in September 1982. They deserved better. They deserved to live their lives, to grow old, to die peacefully surrounded by people who loved them. They deserved justice, answers, some sense that their deaths had meaning beyond random violence.